Just before 7:15 in the morning, on November 1st, 1952, a small island in the Central Pacific had only seconds left to exist. Its name was Elugelab. On American maps, it carried the code name Flora. It sat on the northern rim of Enewetak Atoll, a thin green sliver of sand and palm on the edge of a turquoise lagoon. For thousands of years, it had been nothing more than a place where birds nested and tides came in. On this particular morning, it held the largest machine human beings had ever tried to detonate. The machine was not a bomb. It could not be dropped from any aircraft. It could not be carried on any truck. It stood roughly 20 feet tall inside a corrugated metal shed, a steel cylinder the size of a small factory boiler, and it weighed more than 80 tons once you counted everything wired to it. At its heart was a flask of liquid heavy hydrogen that had to be kept colder than -250 degrees Celsius. To hold that cold in the tropical heat, engineers had built an entire refrigeration plant beside it, a hissing tangle of pumps and vacuum lines and insulated pipe that ran day and night. The coldest object on the face of the Earth was sitting on a coral island 3 degrees north of the equator, and a small army of technicians was fighting the sun to keep it that way. 30 miles away, on the deck of a command ship, a firing party watched the clock. They wore dark goggles. They had been told to turn away at the moment of detonation and to keep their arms across their faces even so. They had been warned that even from this distance, the heat of the thing would reach out across the water and press against them. Nobody on that ship knew for certain what would happen. The calculations said one thing. The calculations had been wrong before. The men who built this device had spent nearly a decade chasing an idea that most of the best physicists in the world had privately decided was impossible. Now that idea was sitting on Elugelab in the dark, and in a few seconds they would learn whether the impossible had a temperature. Before we go on, I want to ask something small of you. Cold War Impact is an independent channel, and honest history like this only travels as far as you help it travel. If you find these deep dives worth your time, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who loves the real story behind the headlines. Every like and every comment tells the algorithm this work matters, and it lets me keep making documentaries the careful way, one verified fact at a time. Thank you. Now, back to the island. For 4 years, the United States had believed it held a monopoly on the ultimate weapon. That belief died in the autumn of 1949. On August 29th of that year, on a windswept steppe in Soviet Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. American analysts would later call it Joe 1, after Joseph Stalin himself. American intelligence had guessed the Soviets were years away, perhaps as late as 1953. They were wrong by a wide margin. The monopoly was gone, and it had lasted a far shorter time than anyone in Washington had dared to fear. On September 23, 1949, President Truman told the world in a short, grim statement that an atomic explosion had occurred inside the Soviet Union. The discovery itself had unfolded like a detective story. A specially equipped aircraft, part of a program set up to sample the upper atmosphere for exactly this signature, had captured radioactive particles drifting high above the North Pacific. When the samples were analyzed, the conclusion was undeniable. Some senior figures in Washington simply refused to believe it at first. The prevailing assumption had been that Soviet industry, gutted by the war against Germany, could not possibly master so enormous a technical challenge this quickly. That assumption had shaped American planning for years, and it had just been proven catastrophically wrong. The reaction in Washington was something close to panic. In this climate, a hard question could no longer be avoided. If the atomic bomb was no longer America's alone, should the United States now build something far worse? Not a bomb that split atoms, but a bomb that fused them, a weapon whose destructive ceiling was, in theory, limitless. In the language of the physicists, they called it the super. In the language of the newspapers that would come later, it was the hydrogen bomb. To understand the decision that followed, you have to feel the fear of that particular moment. In the span of a single year, the American sense of security simply collapsed. The Soviet bomb ended the atomic monopoly. The communist victory in the long Chinese Civil War brought the world's most populous nation into the opposing camp. Then, the following summer, war erupted on the Korean peninsula, and American troops were soon being driven back toward the sea by an enemy nobody had expected to move. To many in Washington, it looked as though the tide of history was running hard against the West, and that every month of hesitation was a gift to an adversary who would show no such restraint. In that atmosphere, caution felt like a luxury the country could not afford. The choice to build the new weapon split the very people best qualified to judge it. On one side stood forceful voices demanding the weapon at once, among them the physicists Ernest Lawrence and Edward Teller, who argued that if such a thing was possible at all, a free nation could not allow a ruthless rival to hold it alone. On the other side stood some of the most respected scientists in the country, who believed that to build a weapon of essentially unlimited destructive power would be to cross a moral line from which there might be no way back. For a few tense months, the argument raged behind closed doors. But in the shadow of the Soviet test, the political logic was becoming impossible to resist. What almost nobody outside a few laboratories understood was that this weapon had a secret problem. The problem was not money, and it was not uranium, and it was not political will. The problem was that the leading design for a hydrogen bomb did not work, and the men who had championed it for years could not admit how badly it did not work. The thing that would finally make Elugulab vanish was not a bigger explosion or a richer budget. It was a single idea, an idea so simple in outline that its own inventors would spend the rest of their lives arguing over who deserved the credit. And for years, that idea had been sitting just out of reach, hidden behind a wrong answer that the smartest people in the field kept insisting was the right one. To understand how one blast erased an island, you have to go back to a morning of quiet humiliation when the United States discovered that its head start on the hydrogen bomb was worth almost nothing. The dream of a fusion weapon was older than the atomic bomb itself. In the autumn of 1941, before the first reactor had ever gone critical, the physicist Enrico Fermi mentioned to a colleague named Edward Teller a strange possibility. An atomic bomb, Fermi mused, might briefly reach the temperatures found inside stars, and at those temperatures, the light elements, hydrogen and its heavier cousins, might fuse together and release energy of their own. Teller could not let the idea go. All through the war, while thousands of people labored to build the fission bombs that would fall on Japan, Teller kept drifting back to the super. He became so fixated on it that he had to be gently reassigned so the main project could stay on schedule. Teller was a man shaped by loss and by a fear of tyranny. Born in Hungary, he had watched as a young man while two brutal regimes, one from the far left and one from the far right, tore his homeland apart. He had lost part of a foot in a streetcar accident and walked with a limp for the rest of his life. Above all, he carried a deep and abiding conviction that free nations could not afford to fall behind ruthless ones in any weapon that truly mattered. That conviction made him brilliant and tireless. It also made him rigid, and in time it would cost him the friendship of nearly everyone he worked beside. But it was that same relentless drive that kept the idea of the super alive through the years when almost everyone else had quietly written it off. It helps to understand what fusion actually is, because it is the opposite of the reaction inside an atomic bomb. An atomic bomb splits heavy atoms apart, and that splitting releases energy. Fusion runs the other way. It forces light atoms, the nuclei of hydrogen, to slam together and merge into heavier ones, and that merging releases far more energy still. It is the reaction that powers the sun and every star in the sky. On Earth, it will not happen on its own. Hydrogen nuclei carry positive charges, and like charges shove each other away. To force them close enough to fuse, you need conditions of heat and pressure found naturally only in the hearts of stars. The whole problem of the hydrogen bomb, stripped to its essence, was how to build a star for a single instant inside a machine. Teller's vision was elegant on paper and treacherous in practice. He imagined a long tube of liquid heavy hydrogen fuel. At one end you would set off an ordinary atomic bomb. The heat from that fission blast, he believed, would light the near end of the tube like a match to a fuse, and a wave of fusion would then race down the length of the fuel, burning it all. This was the design that came to be called the classical super. For years it was the assumption underneath the entire American program. And for years, very few people looked closely enough to see that it was built on sand. There had been warnings for anyone willing to hear them. As early as the spring of 1946, the leading thinkers on the weapon had gathered at Los Alamos for a secret conference on the super. The report that came out of it judged the design broadly workable, yet several of those present grumbled that the conclusion was far too hopeful and rested on assumptions nobody had actually tested. One of the attendees at that meeting, taking careful notes throughout, was a quiet, well-liked British physicist named Klaus Fuchs, whose presence in the room would take on a much darker meaning only later. The optimism carried the day anyway, because the alternative, admitting that the program's flagship idea might be a fantasy, was more than the Enterprise could bear to face. The trouble was heat loss. A star holds itself together with its own crushing gravity, which gives the fusion reactions time and pressure to sustain themselves. A bomb has no such luxury. In the instant after ignition, energy pours out of the fuel as radiation faster than fresh fusion reactions can replace it. The fire, in effect, blows itself out before it can spread. To keep the reaction alive, you would need enormous quantities of tritium, a form of hydrogen so rare and so expensive that producing enough of it would cripple the rest of the weapons program. Nobody wanted this to be true, so for a long time nobody proved that it was. The proof finally came from mathematics. In the winter of 1949 and into 1950, Stanislaw Ulam, a Polish-born mathematician at Los Alamos, sat down with a colleague named Cornelius Everett and began grinding through the numbers of the classical super by hand. The work was brutal, page after page of calculation. What they found was devastating. The design demanded far more tritium than anyone had assumed, so much that the whole scheme became impractical. Fermi and Ulam then attacked the deeper question of whether the fusion fire would even propagate down the tube, and their answer was no. It would sputter and die. Around the same time, one of the very first electronic computers, driven by the mathematician John von Neumann, chewed through the same problem and confirmed the verdict. Von Neumann had once estimated that a full-hand computation of the super would need 100 human calculators working for 4 years. The machines did it faster, and the machines agreed. Nearly every hopeful assumption behind the classical super was wrong. It is one of the quieter ironies of the era that the modern computer and the hydrogen bomb grew up together, each driving the other forward. The calculations needed to model the weapon were so vast that they could not be finished by hand in any useful span of time, and so the weapons laboratories became among the first and most demanding customers for electronic computing. The machines that would one day sit on every desk on Earth were first bent to the task of working out how to burn hydrogen in a bomb. Progress on the weapon and progress on the computer advanced side by side, tangled together from the very start. This was the quiet catastrophe underneath the loud confidence of 1950. President Truman had, on January 31, 1950, publicly ordered a crash program to build the hydrogen bomb. The nation was mobilizing to construct a weapon whose only serious blueprint had just been shown to be a dead end. The United States had committed to winning a race while holding a map that led nowhere. And on the other side of the world, a rival program was gathering speed, led by men who had reasons to believe they might get there first. The Soviet effort did not begin from a position of weakness. It began from a position of theft, discipline, and genuine brilliance, and its leaders knew it. The entire enterprise sat under the control of Lavrenti Beria, the head of Stalin's secret police, a man who ran the atomic program the way he ran everything else, through fear. Beria commanded not only the scientists but the labor of the prison camps that mined the uranium. Failure, everyone understood, would not mean a demotion. It would mean a cell, or worse. Under that shadow, the Soviet scientists worked with extraordinary intensity. At the scientific head of the effort stood Igor Kurchatov, a bearded, driven physicist whom the Soviet system had made the master of the entire nuclear project. Kurchatov had coaxed the first Soviet reactor to life in the winter of 1946, in the ruins of a country that had just lost more than 20 million people in the war against Germany. The resources poured into his program were staggering for a nation in that condition. Whole secret cities were built for the work and left off every published map, their residents forbidden to say where they lived or what they did. The Soviet Union treated the bomb not as one project among many, but as the single most important thing the state could accomplish, and it bent everything it had toward that end. They also worked with a head start that the Americans had unknowingly handed them. During the war, a German-born physicist named Klaus Fuchs had worked inside Los Alamos, trusted, respected, and secretly loyal to Moscow. Fuchs passed the Soviets a torrent of detailed information about the American atomic bomb, and he also passed along what little was then known about early thermonuclear ideas. When the Soviets built their first atomic bomb, it was very nearly a copy of the American plutonium device, because Beria did not trust his own scientists to improve on a design he knew already worked. The espionage was real, and it mattered. It saved the Soviet program time and told them which paths were worth pursuing. But here lies one of the most misunderstood facts in the whole story, and it is worth stating plainly. Klaus Fuchs could not have handed over the secret of the hydrogen bomb, because when he had access to it, the secret did not yet exist. The early thermonuclear ideas he carried east were the same flawed classical super concepts that would later collapse under Ulam's calculations. Any Soviet program built on that information was building on the same sand the Americans were. Fuchs accelerated the Soviet atomic bomb by perhaps a year or two. He did not, and could not, give away a working hydrogen bomb, because the world's finest minds had not yet figured one out. Fuchs was arrested in Britain and confessed, and on March 1, 1950, he was convicted of espionage, adding one more jolt of fear to an already frightened Washington. The real Soviet breakthrough came from their own people. A young physicist named Andrei Sakharov, working on the problem, proposed what he called the first idea. Instead of a long tube, he imagined a layered sphere, alternating shells of fusion fuel and heavy uranium wrapped around a fissioning core. The Russians called it sloika, after a layered pastry. In English, it became the layer cake. Then another physicist, Vitaly Ginzburg, contributed what was called the second idea, a suggestion to use a solid compound of lithium and heavy hydrogen, built around a particular form of lithium, as the fuel. When bombarded with neutrons, that solid would breed its own tritium in place. It was clever, it was compact, and crucially, it could be dropped from an aircraft. The Soviet designers had good reason for confidence. Their approach was practical, it drew on real physics, and it was moving towards something a bomber could actually carry. What they did not yet grasp was that their elegant layer cake had a ceiling. It could be made powerful, but it could not be made unlimited, and the reason why would decide the entire race. While Sakharov's team refined their pastry of uranium and hydrogen, the Americans were staring at the ruins of their own plan and beginning, slowly, to find a way out. The turning point came in the early weeks of 1951, and it came from the same man who had helped destroy the old design. Stanislaw Ulam, still turning the problem over in his mind, had an insight that had nothing to do with lighting a fuse. What if you did not rely on heat alone? What if, instead, you used the fission bomb to physically crush the fusion fuel first, compressing it to enormous density before trying to ignite it? Squeeze the fuel hard enough, and reactions that would never sustain themselves in a loose tube might suddenly catch and hold. Ulam took the idea to his colleagues, and eventually to Teller. Ulam was an unlikely father for the most destructive concept of the century. He was a pure mathematician by temperament, drawn to elegant abstractions rather than engines of war. He had left Europe before the Second World War closed in, and he lost much of his family in the Holocaust, and he carried that grief into everything that came after. His relationship with Teller had cooled to the point of open friction. So when the crucial idea came to him, he did not rush straight to the one man most obsessed with the super. He talked it over first with others, testing whether the notion held together, before he ever carried it to the colleague he knew would take it furthest. It was a very human hesitation, standing at the birth of an inhuman weapon. Teller seized on it, and then improved it in a way that made all the difference. The compression, he realized, should not come from the mechanical shock of the blast, which would arrive too slowly and too messily. It should come from radiation. When a fission bomb detonates, it releases an intense flood of X-rays that move at the speed of light, far faster than any physical shockwave. Contain that radiation inside a specially designed case, Teller reasoned, and you could use it to compress a separate capsule of fusion fuel with staggering, uniform force in the instant before the blast tore everything apart. Set off the atomic bomb at one end of a sealed case. Let its radiation bathe and crush the fuel at the other end. Then, and only then, ignite it. This was the concept that would come to be known as the Teller-Ulam design, and it is, in its essentials, how every hydrogen bomb on Earth still works today. The two men set it down in a report dated March 9, 1951. Almost immediately, the argument began over which of them deserved the credit, and it never really ended. Teller, late in life, would say bluntly that he had contributed and that Ulam had not. Ulam's defenders pointed out that the crucial first step, the leap to compression, had been Ulam's. One of the engineers who actually built the first device offered perhaps the fairest summary years later. Ulam, he said, deserved credit for provoking Teller to do a real calculation, and Teller then thought of something that everyone, in hindsight, should have seen. Historians today tend to split the credit, giving Teller the larger share and Ulam a substantial one, while noting that others contributed pieces too. What is not in dispute is that the idea worked, and that it had been hiding in plain sight, blocked for years by the stubborn belief that the old broken design was good enough. Before anyone would risk the full experiment, the principle had to be shown to work even in miniature. In the spring of 1951, at the same Pacific Proving Ground, the Americans ran a test called George. It was not a true hydrogen bomb. It was a large fission device rigged to ignite a tiny quantity of fusion fuel. just enough to prove that the radiation from a fission blast really could kindle a thermonuclear reaction. The test worked. For the first time in history, human beings had produced fusion energy on Earth through a nuclear explosion, even if only the faintest spark of it. The spark was enough. It told the designers that the physics was sound, and that the far larger gamble taking shape in the Pacific was worth the risk. Now the Americans had a concept that might actually function. What they did not have was proof, and turning a concept into a working device meant solving a mountain of practical problems that had defeated lesser plans. The fuel Teller and Ulam envisioned in that first full test was liquid deuterium, a heavy form of hydrogen that only becomes liquid at temperatures near absolute zero. This was the great difficulty, and in a sense the great flaw, of the first attempt. To prove the principle quickly, the designers chose the fuel that was easiest to understand and hardest to handle. A weapon fueled by a substance that boils away unless kept colder than the poles of Mars is not a weapon at all. It is a science experiment the size of a building. Everyone involved understood that whatever they detonated first would be a test article, a demonstration, and not something any pilot could ever deliver to a target. The job of turning the theory into an actual apparatus fell, remarkably, to a young man barely out of graduate school. His name was Richard Garwin, and in the summer of 1951 he was 23 years old, a physics instructor spending his break at Los Alamos. Fermi, who had taught him, called him the only true genius he had ever met. Teller handed Garwin the concept and asked him to design the experiment that would test it. Garwin did exactly that. He drew up the practical device, laying out how the components would fit together to make the physics reveal itself with the least possible doubt. He built it, in his own later words, to be conservative, to be as certain as possible that it would work, because a failed first test would have set the program back by years and handed the initiative to the Soviets. Garwin's central role would remain almost unknown to the public for half a century. He did not seek the spotlight, and the histories written in the meantime barely mentioned him. Garwin was far from alone. The work rested on an entire theoretical division at Los Alamos, led with quiet discipline by Norris Bradbury, the man who had taken over the laboratory after Oppenheimer left, and by the head of the theory group, Carson Mark. It was painstaking, error-prone labor, and a single mistake could ruin the whole test. One young physicist, Marshall Rosenbluth, going back over the numbers, caught a flaw that, left uncorrected, might have turned the great experiment into an embarrassing failure. This was the reality behind the myth of the lone genius. The weapon that erased Elugelab was the product of hundreds of people checking one another's arithmetic under crushing pressure, aware that the world was watching, and that the Soviets were coming on fast. By the middle of 1952, the pieces were converging on a single point in the Pacific. The pressure driving them was immense. Korea had settled into a grinding, bloody stalemate. The Soviet program was known to be advancing, though its exact progress was a matter of fearful guesswork. American planners lived with the assumption that the enemy might already be close to a thermonuclear weapon of some kind, and that assumption was not paranoid. It was, as events would prove, roughly correct. If the Soviets crossed the fusion threshold first, the psychological and strategic consequences could be severe. The order came down to test, and to test soon, and so the enormous, impossible apparatus was assembled on Elugelab. The scale of it defies easy description. The device sat inside a building of its own. Beside it stood the refrigeration plant needed to keep the deuterium liquid, fed by its own dedicated power supply. Running out from the shed, across nearly 9,000 feet of the atoll, engineers had built a long tube filled with helium and lined with baffles, a strange plywood and metal corridor designed to carry the flash of radiation to distant instruments before the blast destroyed everything. On neighboring islands, banks of cameras and gauges waited to record events that would unfold in millionths of a second. More than 9,000 military personnel and over 2,000 civilians took part in the operation. A steel tower some 300 feet tall rose over the site. The whole atoll had become a single vast instrument built for one reading. The device itself had a nickname, as these things often did. The men who worked on it called it the sausage, for its long cylindrical shape. Its outer casing was a steel shell with walls nearly a foot thick, among the largest single pieces of forged steel produced anywhere up to that time. Inside that shell, an ordinary atomic bomb sat at one end to serve as the trigger, and the great flask of cryogenic fuel filled most of the rest. Simple enough to state in a sentence, and monstrously hard to build. It was the difference between sketching a bridge on a napkin and raising one that will carry the weight of a city. Operation Ivy, as the whole effort was called, was one of the largest scientific and military undertakings of its kind ever mounted. A fleet of ships gathered off the atoll. Aircraft stood ready to fly through the radioactive cloud minutes after the blast to gather samples, their crews accepting doses of radiation as part of the assignment. Thousands of men lived for months on cramped vessels and tiny islands, sworn to secrecy, many with only the vaguest notion of what they were helping to build. And all of it, the ships, the planes, the refrigeration plant, the miles of cable, existed to serve a single event that would be over in far less time than it takes to draw a breath. Keeping the fuel cold was a race against time, as much as against temperature. The liquid deuterium had to be poured into the device at nearly the last possible moment before the shot, because every hour that passed was another hour in which something could fail. A spare part, if one broke, sat thousands of miles away across open ocean. In the final days, the greatest fear on Elugelab was not that the physics would let them down. It was that a pump or a valve or a seal would quietly give out, that the coldest thing on the island would warm and boil away, and that months of work and a piece of history would drain into the sand with it. What would happen when the firing signal reached Elugelab depended on a chain of events so fast and so precise that the human mind can barely hold them in sequence. Everything had to go right, in order, in the space of less than a millionth of a second, or the whole effort would end in an expensive, radioactive failure. If the atomic bomb at the core, the primary, fired cleanly, it would flood the sealed case with X-rays. If the case held that radiation and channeled it correctly, the flood would crush the capsule of liquid deuterium to many times its normal density. If the compression was even and complete, a small plug of fissioning material at the center of the fuel would ignite, driving the temperature past the threshold where hydrogen fuses. If that fusion caught and held, it would release a burst of high-energy neutrons so intense that they would split the heavy uranium jacket wrapped around the fuel, and that fissioning jacket would add most of the final, staggering yield. Fission to light the fusion, and fusion to drive a second, far larger fission. Each stage depended entirely on the one before it. A single weak link anywhere in the chain, and the fire would die in the dark. In the final minutes, the atoll went quiet. The order came for all hands to take their assigned positions and make ready. A countdown crackled over loudspeakers and radios across the fleet. Men who had poured months of their lives into this one moment now had nothing left to do but wait and listen. Some prayed. Some simply stared toward the dark line of the horizon where the island lay unseen. There was by then no calling it back. The final sequence had been handed to automatic timers that no human hand could reach. Whatever was about to happen would happen on its own. The firing signal went out in the last seconds before 7:15. What followed did not feel, to the men who witnessed it, like an explosion in any ordinary sense. It felt like a change in the nature of the world. The first thing was light, not a flash, but a sustained, swelling glare that turned the pre-dawn Pacific into something whiter than noon. Men 30 miles away, facing away with their eyes shut behind dark glass, still saw the flash come through their closed eyelids, a white glare with nothing like it anywhere in their experience. Then came the heat, and this was the detail the witnesses never forgot. The heat did not strike and pass, the way it does with a lesser blast. It arrived, and it stayed, pressing on the backs of their necks and the sides of their faces for long seconds that stretched toward a minute, as though a furnace door had swung open across 30 miles of ocean and refused to close. The fireball swelled to more than 3 miles across. On the island, the coldest object on Earth had become, for a fraction of a second, one of the hottest places in the solar system, briefly rivaling the interior of the sun. The liquid deuterium that technicians had guarded so carefully against the tropical warmth was gone in an instant, converted into an outrush of energy on a scale nothing man-made had ever approached. The uranium jacket fissioned in a torrent. Roughly 3/4 of the total force came not from the fusion itself, but from that surrounding uranium tearing apart under the neutron flood. Then the shock wave crossed the water, a wall of compressed air that slammed the command ship and rolled on past. The mushroom cloud climbed with terrible speed. In about 90 seconds it punched through 57,000 feet. A minute later it had reached beyond 100,000 feet, and it finally spread against the ceiling of the sky at an altitude near 120,000 feet. Its top flattening into a canopy that stretched 60 to 100 miles across. Ice and pulverized coral and vaporized steel churned inside it. When the cloud thinned and the instruments were read, and the reconnaissance planes flew their sampling runs through the poisoned air, one fact stood out above all the numbers. The island was gone. Elugelab, the green sliver that had existed for thousands of years, simply was not there anymore. In its place, the ocean had rushed in to fill a crater on the sea floor, a bowl of shattered coral more than a mile wide and roughly 160 feet deep. Parts of neighboring islands had been stripped and gouged as well. The physicist Marshall Rosenbluth, who had helped build the device, later described the island as vanishing with a force some 700 times greater than the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. The final measured yield was 10.4 megatons. In one shot, the destructive power available to the human species had jumped not by a factor of 2 or 3, but by a factor of hundreds. It is worth pausing on what that yield actually means, because the mind tends to slide off numbers this large. All of the bombs dropped by all the air forces of the entire Second World War, across 6 years of fighting, added together, amounted to roughly 3 megatons of explosive power. The single device on Elugelab released more than 3 times that total in a fraction of a second. One weapon, in one instant, had surpassed the entire destructive output of the deadliest war in human history. There was one small, almost surreal footnote to all this destruction. When scientists later studied the radioactive debris scooped from the cloud by those sampling flights, they found something genuinely new in the wreckage. In the fury of the blast, the intense flood of neutrons had forced uranium atoms to swallow particle after particle and transform into elements that had never before existed on Earth. 2 of them were isolated and named. One became Einsteinium, the other Fermium, in honor of Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi. The same explosion that erased an island had, almost as an afterthought, created forms of matter that nature itself had apparently never made. The man most responsible for the idea behind it was not there to see it. Edward Teller, who had chased the super for a decade, had made himself so difficult to work with that the physicists who actually built the device did not much want him around. He watched from the mainland instead. In the basement of a building at Berkeley, he sat and stared at the trembling line of a seismograph, waiting for the shock of the distant blast to travel through the Earth itself and reach California. When the faint tremor finally arrived, right on schedule, Teller was so moved that he said his own hand shook as he tried to read the instrument. He then broke security protocol to send a short, coded telegram to his colleagues at Los Alamos. It contained 3 words: "It's a boy." For all its magnitude, the test was born in secrecy and stayed there for a long time. The government said nothing official about what had happened at Eniwetok. Yet the truth proved almost impossible to contain. Reporters, piecing together ship movements and travel records and the sudden silences of people who normally talked, guessed both the fact and the timing of the shot within hours. It would be well over a year before the United States formally admitted to the world what it had done. By then, the age it had opened was already well underway, and the next, even more terrible test was already being prepared. The cold thing had become fire, and the fire had rewritten the meaning of the word war. But the full reckoning of what had just been unleashed, in Soviet laboratories, on Pacific Islanders, and on the men who had built it, would take years to arrive, and some of that reckoning is still arriving today. On the far side of the world, the Soviet program reached its own milestone the following summer, and here the popular story is almost always told wrong. On August 12, 1953, the Soviet Union detonated the layer cake device that Sakharov and Ginzburg had designed. It yielded roughly 400 kilotons, about 20 times the Nagasaki bomb, and the Soviets announced to the world that the American monopoly on the hydrogen bomb was over. In one narrow and important sense, they were telling the truth. Their device used fusion, and unlike the American monster on Elugelab, it was compact enough to be carried by a bomber. It was, arguably, the first deliverable thermonuclear weapon in history, but it was not the same kind of thing that had erased Elugelab, and the difference was decisive. The layer cake did not use the staged radiation compression principle of the Teller-Ulam design. Only a modest fraction of its power came from fusion. It was, in truth, a very powerful atomic bomb with a fusion boost, and it carried a fatal limitation. It could not be scaled up without limit. You could not simply stack more layers and reach the megaton range. The design had a ceiling, and the Soviets soon understood it. To match what the Americans had proven possible, they would have to make the same conceptual leap that Ulam and Teller had made. Sakharov and his colleagues eventually did, arriving at what they called the third idea, their own version of staged radiation compression. Only on November 22, 1955, when they airdropped a genuinely 2-stage weapon that yielded over 1.5 megatons, did the Soviet Union truly stand where the United States had stood 3 years earlier. That test came at a human cost even before its fallout spread. The blast wave, focused unexpectedly by the layered air above the site, collapsed a building and killed several people on the ground. The Americans, meanwhile, had already turned their fragile experiment into a real weapon, and in doing so, they had caused one of the worst radiological accidents of the century. The device on Illugelab had been useless as a weapon because of its cryogenic fuel. The obvious fix was the very solid fuel the Soviets had reached for, lithium deuteride, which needed no refrigeration. On March 1, 1954, the United States tested such a design at Bikini Atoll, in a shot named Castle Bravo. The designers expected a yield of around 6 megatons. They got 15. They had badly misjudged how one component of the lithium fuel would behave under bombardment, and the weapon produced more than twice its predicted force. It remains the largest nuclear weapon the United States has ever detonated. The error did not stay contained to a spreadsheet. The unexpected size of the blast, combined with a shift in the winds, carried a plume of intensely radioactive fallout far beyond the danger zone that had been marked off. It settled over inhabited atolls downwind, coating them in a fine white ash that children, not knowing what it was, reportedly played in. It also settled on a Japanese fishing boat named the Lucky Dragon, working what its crew believed were safe waters well outside the test area. The entire crew fell ill with radiation sickness. The boat's radio operator, a man named Aikichi Kuboyama, died months later, on September 23, 1954. He is generally remembered as the first person killed by a hydrogen bomb. His death set off a wave of anger across Japan and around the world, and it gave the public a new and permanent vocabulary of dread. The word fallout entered everyday speech. From there, the numbers only climbed as each side raced to prove it could reach higher than the other. The competition reached its grim summit on October 30, 1961, when the Soviet Union detonated a device over the Arctic island chain of Novaya Zemlya that remains the most powerful explosion ever produced by human beings. Its yield was around 50 megatons, and the designers had deliberately cut it down from a possible 100 megatons to keep the fallout within some bound. Its fireball spread several miles wide. Its cloud rose more than 37 miles into the sky, far above the altitude where airliners fly. The flash was visible from over 600 miles away. It was never a usable weapon. It was a statement, a demonstration that the ceiling everyone had feared was, in principle, no ceiling at all. The arrival of the hydrogen bomb did more than raise the numbers on a chart. It changed the entire logic of war between great powers. When a single aircraft could carry a weapon able to erase a city many times over, the old idea of winning a war by outproducing and outfighting an enemy began to lose its meaning. Strategists arrived at a grim new doctrine. The only real defense against such weapons, they concluded, was the certainty that any attack would be answered in kind, that both sides would perish together. Peace in this strange new world would rest on the guarantee of mutual annihilation. It was a fragile and terrifying kind of stability, and in its essentials, it is the same uneasy balance the world still lives under today. The moral cost of all this landed hardest on the man who had tried, at the very beginning, to slow it down. In the autumn of 1949, before the crash program began, the senior scientific advisors to the Atomic Energy Commission had been asked whether the United States should pursue the hydrogen bomb with all its might. Their committee, chaired by Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who had led the wartime effort to build the first atomic bomb, said no. In a written judgment, some of them called the proposed weapon a thing that should never be brought into the world, and two of the members described it as necessarily an evil thing considered in any light. They lost that argument. And 5 years later, in the poisoned atmosphere of the era, Oppenheimer's earlier opposition was turned into a weapon against him. In a security hearing in 1954, his loyalty was questioned and his access to secret work was stripped away, in part on the strength of testimony from Teller, who suggested the nation's affairs would rest more safely in other hands. Much of the scientific community never forgave Teller for it. It would take until December 16, 2022, nearly 7 decades later, for the United States government to formally set aside that decision and declare that the process against Oppenheimer had been unjust. The Soviet program produced a troubled conscience of its own. Andrei Sakharov, whose ideas had given his country its first thermonuclear weapons, grew steadily more horrified by what he had helped to bring into the world. He watched the enormous test rise over the Arctic and came to believe that these weapons threatened the survival of the species itself. In the years that followed, he became the most famous dissident in the Soviet Union. campaigning for arms control and for human rights. And for that, his government stripped him of his honors and banished him into internal exile. The man who had built the bombs turned into one of the loudest voices on earth against them. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, an honor the authorities would not permit him to travel and accept. For the people who had lived on the islands, there was no such reckoning and no going home. The men who ran the tests are gone now, but the consequences of what they did are still measured in the bodies and the maps of the Marshallese. And that is where this story stops being about physics and starts being about the people who were never asked. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 atmospheric nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, 23 at Bikini and 44 at Enewetak, the very atoll where Elugalab had once stood. The people who lived on those atolls were moved off their ancestral land to make room for the weapons. The community of Bikini was relocated in March of 1946 to a smaller, poorer island where the fishing was thin and the food ran short, and within 2 years they were close to starvation. The people of Enewetak were removed in December of 1947 and sent to a cramped atoll far away. Some of them, or their children, were allowed to return decades later, in 1980, after a cleanup, but not to everywhere. Parts of their home remain too contaminated to inhabit even now. The health consequences fell most heavily on those who were downwind of the largest tests, and the science here deserves to be stated carefully rather than sensationally. A detailed study by American cancer researchers, drawing on decades of data, estimated that across the whole of the Marshall Islands, a small percentage of all cancers among people alive during the testing years could be attributed to the fallout. But that average hides the real story because the burden was wildly unequal. It concentrated on the handful of northern communities that had been dusted by the worst of the plumes. For the people of one particularly exposed atoll, researchers estimated that fallout might account for more than half of all the cancers they would suffer. Among one group of children on that atoll who were small at the time of Castle Bravo, nearly everyone had developed thyroid abnormalities within 2 decades. Women in the affected communities gave testimony in later years of miscarriages and of pregnancies that ended in ways they had no words for and no history of before the tests came. These were not statistics to them. They were their own families. The physical residue of the testing did not go away either. When the United States conducted its cleanup of Enewetak in the late 1970s, it faced the problem of what to do with tons of radioactive soil and debris. The solution was to scrape it up, dump it into a crater left by one of the blasts on an island called Runit, and cap it with a dome of concrete. That dome, built between 1977 and 1980, holds more than 100,000 cubic yards of contaminated waste under a concrete shell about 18 inches thick. The Marshallese call it, among other things, the tomb. It was never lined underneath, and it was built on porous coral in a crater that connects to the sea. Today it is cracking, and it sits only a couple of meters above a rising ocean. Scientists who study it warn that seawater already moves in and out of the waste beneath the dome, and that storm surge and sea level rise, not sudden collapse, are the real long-term threats to its integrity. A structure built to entomb the past is being slowly undermined by the future. And the weapons themselves never went away. They only grew quieter and more numerous. The hydrogen bomb, born on Elugalab, remains the core of the arsenals that the great powers still point at one another. Essentially, every strategic warhead in the American and Russian stockpiles today is a descendant of the staged radiation compression design that Ulam sketched and Teller refined and Garwin first built into steel. As of the most recent public estimates, the United States holds a stockpile of roughly 3,700 warheads with somewhere near 1,700 deployed and ready. Russia holds even more, a stockpile of roughly 4,300 warheads with over 1,700 of them deployed, and a total inventory closer to 5,400 once the weapons awaiting dismantlement are counted. The specific numbers shift from year to year. The underlying physics has not changed since 1952. What has changed, and not for the better, is the framework that once held those numbers in check. For decades, a series of arms control treaties limited how many strategic weapons the two largest nuclear powers could deploy. The last of those treaties, which capped each side at 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, reached the end of its life on February 5, 2026. Russia had already suspended its participation years earlier. For the first time since the early 1970s, there is now no binding limit at all on the two largest thermonuclear arsenals on Earth. The guardrails that generations of diplomats built, piece by anxious piece, have come down, and nothing agreed and verified has yet been raised in their place. The old two-way contest, meanwhile, is quietly becoming a three-way one. For most of the nuclear age, the truly vast arsenals belonged to just two powers. That is changing. China, long the holder of a comparatively small force, has been expanding and modernizing its nuclear weapons at a pace that has alarmed analysts on both sides of the Pacific, and by the Pentagon's own projections, it is on course to field well over 1,000 warheads within the coming decade. None of the treaties that once restrained the two original superpowers bind it in any way. The framework built for a world of two nuclear giants is now being asked to hold a world that no longer looks anything like that. The people of the Marshall Islands are still asking for something the great powers have never fully given them, which is an honest accounting and a fair repair. A tribunal set up to compensate them for what was done to their land and their bodies calculated that they were owed billions of dollars. The fund created to pay those claims held only a tiny fraction of that sum, and most of what was awarded has never been paid. When a new agreement between the Marshall Islands and the United States was signed in recent years, it set aside a trust for the nuclear-affected communities, but that trust, too, fell far short of what the islanders say they are owed, and it did not resolve the underlying dispute. Standing before the United Nations, the president of the Marshall Islands put the whole history into a single sentence. Her people, she said, did not choose this nuclear fate. It was chosen for them. There is a final figure in this story who deserves to be remembered, precisely because he was so easy to overlook. Richard Garwin, the young man who designed the device that vaporized Elugelab, never became famous for it in his lifetime, and never seemed to want to. He went on to a long and extraordinary career in science and public service, advising presidents, warning against the very arms race he had helped begin, and receiving, at last, the nation's highest civilian honor. He lived to the age of 97 and died in the spring of 2025. Late in his life, people sometimes asked him what it had been like to watch the fruit of his work rise over the Pacific. His answer was always the same, and it said more about the whole enterprise than any statistic could. He had never seen a nuclear explosion, he told them. He had never wanted to take the time. That is perhaps the strangest truth at the center of this history. The bomb that changed the shape of the 20th century, that erased an island from the map and put a permanent shadow over the human future, was designed by a man who did not care to look at it, championed by a man who watched a needle twitch a continent away, and built on an idea that had been sitting in reach for years while the experts insisted it could not be done. Elugelab did not disappear because of a bigger explosion. It disappeared because a small number of people finally arranged the pieces in the right order and then could not stop themselves from finding out what would happen. The lagoon has long since filled the crater where the island used to be. The water there is calm now and blue, and it gives no sign of what it covers. But the question that morning answered has never gone quiet. Once a species learns to build a fire with no natural limit, the only thing standing between that fire and the world is the choice, made and remade every single day, not to light it.